A bit of housekeeping. We've created a different Defense Port podcast channel, Defense Port Wires Brief, where within 3 to 6 minutes we will discuss the latest defense, intelligence, and security news that's happened over the past 24 hours. Please check it out and subscribe. Welcome back to the Defense Port Podcast. We've had a bit of a summer hiatus, schedules and whatnot. Chris, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. I guess I should say
greetings from the future. Good morning to you. Good afternoon here. So,
right? I mean, you're in Ontario. I'm in BC. I guess I should say I'm Stewart Webb, senior analyst and editor, and with me is Chris Murray, our associate editor and senior analyst. So today we're going to be talking about the events that happened last week at the Spanish enclave of Ceuta.
Yeah, that seems to be the hot thing blowing up my feed. I don't know what that says about my algorithm, but I've been seeing a lot of it. And I proposed this to Stewart to talk about this, but in the larger context of the Mediterranean, which I sort of see as, I call it the Mediterranean frontline, or soon to be future frontline. I don't know if you want to have me lay that out or just sort of walk through it, or do you just want to sort of explore it and see where we end up?
Well, we can explore it, but, you don't want to talk about the Mediterranean. I also wanted to talk about Africa, right? Because both linked.
Yeah, and that's the implication, or what the implied meaning behind frontline is. I see the Mediterranean as this really important frontline for Europe and the EU, and given where my focus is on Southeastern Europe and the Balkans, and your focus on Africa, I thought it was a really opportune moment for us to sort of combine those two things, because when I say frontline or flank, there's an implied meaning there which relates to or is referencing Africa. There's sort of a economic, security, cultural, dare I say, civilizational fault line or front line there between the two that's quite inflamed, obviously has been for quite some time. And I thought that was the context in which to look at Ceuta.
So I guess we should lay the groundwork of the conversation. So today, Italy has suspended the Schengen visa, border-free with Spain. And last week, it was between 49,000 and 60,000 migrants that swam
depending on who you talk to, yeah.
Right? Still, tens of thousands that swam from Morocco to the Spanish enclave of Ceuta, which is still part of Africa.
Swam or walked?
A bit of both, right?
Yeah, I saw
57 drowned, I think, was the total.
Yeah, this is an important point. Sorry to jump in on you as you're literally in your first sentence of explaining. My understanding is that the Spanish Supreme Court recently ruled there was protections for those who arrive by sea versus those who arrive by land. There's a legal difference in terms of deporting them, which is an important distinction. And I don't know, it's very hard to suss out between media and social media what is actually going on. But what I was seeing were people walking along the shore or like swimming out and around a jetty. So I don't know if that technically arrived by sea or if we can say they swam there or they walked there. I guess it's a bit of both. Sorry, I just wanted to sort of jump on that and say, yeah.
No, I mean, obviously we need to, frame it properly, right? I mean, obviously they're not, with Ceuta, you obviously had to look it up because you're like, okay, the Spanish enclave, so they swam across, the Strait of Gibraltar. No, of course not, right? It's still part of Africa. So probably the tides were just right for them to swim, walk in shallower and more calm waters.
Yeah, I would think it would be perhaps, forgive me if my ignorance, but perhaps akin to Mexico. Like if you were coming up Baja or something like that, you walked up the coast and sort of swam out around the breakwalls or something like that. I'm not sure. I saw videos of scores of people walking across what looked like a breakwall. I don't know if it was attached to the land or how or anything like that because it's hard to tell from the frame. And I also saw a bunch of people storming through gates. And I did see people coming out of the water. So it shows how much we know about what's going on there, I guess.
But Spanish police did crack down. Many of the migrants did return back to Morocco. There were some that stayed behind and looted some businesses, had some clashes with police, something that you'd expect.
Yeah, so this is another source of ambiguity, right? Like, depending on who you talk to, you can get numbers as low as 30 and as high as 90,000. Numbers of like, oh, they pretty much all went back. But I saw open source intel on X, that account, and it was showing a large number of people who were camped out in areas, which suggests that at least some of them have stayed. And I've also seen some videos of military now arriving because Pedro Sanchez saying he was calling in the military, but I saw an interview with the military on the ground there that were saying all we can really do right now is ask them to leave. We have been informed or instructed, and this is, not official. This is just what I'm seeing, and I don't know. It hasn't been verified, but they have some pretty strict, I guess, for lack of a better term, ROE, rules of engagement, where they're not, which isn't really a proper application of the term. But it sounds like that they're limited in what they're going to do. They haven't figured that out yet beyond asking to leave. But yes, most of them have left. Some of them are still there, and there was violence. There are videos circulating of people, quite literally, like brutal videos of people actually getting into knife fights and getting stabbed in the street. Not to suggest it's widespread, but it did happen. I think the vast majority of fatalities were associated with drownings and crowd crushing, but again, there's still a lot of uncertainty.
The enclave of Ceuta itself, we should talk about, the population is approximately 80,000. So an influx of between 49 to 60,000 migrants is
significant.
Is very significant. And of course,
we're talking about 18 or 20 square kilometers, 80 to 85,000 people.
The police infrastructure for that enclave cannot.
It's not built for that.
Not built for that whatsoever, and hence why so many migrants were able to actually get into Ceuta itself.
And there is something to talk about too about where these all came from, because it would be important. It would be a failure on our part not to acknowledge that there's videos that are coming out there of truckloads of these migrants arriving at or near the border, and there appear to be uniformed officers. I don't know if they're local police or whatever on the Moroccan side who are supervising this or at least watching it happen and not doing anything about it. So that's led to some of the tension that's occurring. Is the question of Morocco's role in this.
Yeah, and of course organized criminals, because that's one of the big issues with illegal migration from Africa to Europe is, the structure of organized crime within Africa and human trafficking.
And that's something we should probably use to segue into a conversation with Africa. But before we do, just one observation I had in connection with that, and I want to be very clear, I'm not implying that this is the case, is just thinking about it and looking at those videos. I was like, if you were a country like Morocco and you disputed, I believe is the word, the Spanish claim on the territory, which Morocco does, they don't recognize it. It would be a very interesting way for a lesser power to test or run a safe sort of test run of either an invasion or alternatively just as a destabilization effort, just to create problems. Similar akin to like what Belarus has been doing along the Polish border. I'm not implying that's what's happening. I thought about that and was like, oh, that's really interesting that you could just use migrants to either destabilize or test an opponent's defenses. And that just a random side thought before we segue away.
It is a hybrid tactic of the weaponization of migration, and I think you are right. If Morocco had some responsibility for this migration, it would be either to lower opinion of Pedro Sanchez and also the Spanish position itself on Ceuta. If holding on to that territorial enclave has now caused a lot of problems with the Spanish position within the EU, right?
Domestic politics, position within the EU, the bloody cost of dealing with it. Yeah, the financial costs.
And so those numbers and the aftershocks within the EU is going to become more apparent to the average Spanish citizen. Right.
Yeah, because the EU is already primed to react to these sort of things after the last decade and the obvious and largely unacknowledged problems that they have due to migration and, shall we say, too liberal a policy towards migration, particularly illegal migration, which is now their chickens are coming home to roost. And you're seeing countries, particularly those on the Mediterranean front line, Greece and Italy, and you're seeing their reaction, and they're getting, a lot more aggressive, militant about doing something about this, and you're likewise seeing policy changes with regards to migration support in places like Denmark, Sweden. So it's a whole of EU. The pendulum is swinging. You had the EU Parliament recently vote to change migration rules so that they can more easily deport people and get them out. And I think you're going to continue to see things trending in that direction. Yeah, this puts into stark relief that problem, that tension in the EU, and it also between progressive and more conservative elements. Like you look at Meloni's Fratelli Italia, I believe that's how you say it, Brothers of Italy party, which is conservative, versus the Sanchez's party, which is, I forget what they're called now. I should know this, but they're obviously like socialist or social democrats, or communist, depending on who you ask, right? Just like some people would say Maloney's a conservative, others would say she's a fascist. It depends on who you talk to, but right versus left. And there's also, like in the case of Spain in particular, Spain has a lot of problems with the EU because they're the ones that are not interested in sort of towing the line. They like the money coming from the EU, but they're not really interested in giving back. And it's the same with NATO, right? They're very quickly becoming a major target for the rest of NATO, which is taking some heat off of Canada. But they're just not interested in spending, and they're not interested in dealing with this. And they also just gave a pathway to permanent residency for, I believe, 500,000 migrants who are there illegally, which, to be fair, there is a certain practical element to that because they have an aging population and they're there illegally. And by doing this, it's legalizing them and it's dealing with the reality that's in front of you. So, but regardless of how you feel on it, I do think that it's going to create a lot more tension in the EU, which is to be expected. Stewart, as you know, I've always been a bit of a Eurosceptic. I don't think that the level of economic integration that they're attempted to pursue is wise. Certainly, Europe should be a free trade zone, and they should standardize things like shipping and whatnot. But I think the cracks are starting to show because there's pressure on it now.
In the aftermath of Ceuta, I believe there was a declaration of 17 different EU countries that they would put a restriction on the Schengen zone for Spain.
Yeah, which would, to those listening, that has to deal with, that's the free movement of people, right, within the EU borders of EU citizens, and that would essentially, and what's I understand is already happening, is Italy's now screening Spanish citizens as if they were from outside of that zone.
And of course, that's caused tensions within Madrid, because on Madrid's position, Ceuta is a Spanish enclave in Africa, so putting restrictions on the Schengen zone for mainland Spain.
More symbolic than practical.
Exactly.
Because it's not actually going to affect them. Although, I mean, I guess the other part for Italy is like this is another staging ground for people to launch from, but it's kind of a silly one because they can launch from anywhere else on the coast too. And that's pretty far from Italy.
Well, the big staging ground for Italy has been Libya in recent history.
But I think it's largely symbolic to sort of prove a point. Plus, Maloney's got an election next year, so that could be part of it too. But I think it speaks to the larger issue, which now that Europe's covered, I'd like to listen to you a little bit about Africa, not to put you on the spot, but pivot back to what you were saying earlier about the organized crime networks that are at the heart of this very lucrative migration movement, smuggling, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, tell me a bit about what's going on in Africa with human migration or smuggling system, and how maybe that relates to some of the other problems that we're seeing.
Of course. So back in 2011, with the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, it's interesting that a lot of it is rooted back to that one conflict, right? Because of the destabilization of the entire country and the ongoing conflict, which is kind of frozen now. Criminal gangs and organizations have been able to take advantage of this, right? And open up human smuggling from Libya into Italy, also into the region that you're more familiar with, the Balkans, right?
Which is also coming from, interestingly, like it's also coming from Turkey and Syria in the Middle East as well at the same time.
Yeah. If we go back to the Afghanistan conflict, right? Before we saw drug smuggling going from east to west, right? Opium and later meth labs were operating out of Afghanistan. Amphetamine pills and other chemical drugs were being shipped from Syria, from ISIS, into Europe. In fact, one of the ISIS-controlled trade routes actually was from Libya to Italy that the Italian Navy had to shut down. And now we're actually seeing more west to east when it comes to drugs. Mexican cartels have actually been using narco submarines, well, not just Mexicans, narco submarines, which are semi-submersible, going from Latin America to like Sierra Leone, where local institutions and coastal security forces can't really fight the corruption and are a lot less equipped for monitoring deep water threats, right? And because
Also,
of that,
must be a lot easier to buy officials there too.
exactly. And because of that, we're also seeing Mexican cartels moving into Africa. Cheap labor is also another one of these things. What happened today, oddly enough, when we're recording, was that Nigeria actually shut down the largest meth lab that it's found this year. So far, there have been 4 meth labs raided. This one was 2.4 tons of chemicals, as well as 300 million euros worth of crystal meth.
Whoa.
Yeah. And the drug cartels are working with, jihadist groups, Boko Haram, Islamic State, West Africa province in Nigeria. They're also working with JNIM in Mali, taking.
Is this for reasons of geography, just to move things?
And also just illicit financing, right? These
Okay.
groups control territory and they can offer protection from local authorities and also have more local knowledge when it comes to illicit smuggling. So going to Mali, Tuareg separatists in the north have traditionally been smugglers of everything from drugs to cigarettes, just to human trafficking, of course. And these drug groups are actually taking advantage of this. And jihadist groups and other criminal organizations are also getting money for this, which is now creating more of a destabilization effect within Africa.
And so all of these things are obviously tied together. So illegal resource extraction is another thing I know is a major problem in Africa, be it gold, diamonds, or what have you. And so that's going to be tied into this. So this is all just about diversified corporation, I suppose, right?
Yeah, and let's go back to Spain, right? So the 2004 Madrid train bombings. Yeah, there were Moroccan, Syrian, and Algerian Muslims who were Al-Qaeda linked who carried out those attacks. But the financing for those attacks actually came from the sales of hashish and ecstasy in Europe. We're already seeing how terrorist groups are also getting, financing from the drug, trade, not just in the production, but also the sale and the protection of those of now Latin American groups. And that's now translating into, and it has been translating for the past 2 decades, into a security threat for Europe. Right. So the only difference now is that instead of opium and some methamphetamine coming from Afghanistan, we're actually now seeing organized drug cartels that have been operating at a very high level globally, now moving eastwards, right? And then up into the north and taking advantage of the insecurity of Africa.
As well as these human migration networks, which I suppose are in part a money-making department for them, but also just them taking advantage of something that's going on, right? Because they can use that network as an opening to funnel their other smuggling operations through, I suppose.
And also drug production as well, right? I mean, if you've got an illegal migrant that's going through this network, you can easily put them to work in a drug production lab or as a human, as a drug mule. That's kind of, the big issue going for the security of Europe now. I mean, it's actually interesting that U.S. AFRICOM is actually providing intelligence to African authorities on drug labs. And so to help their efforts to raid these facilities.
Which are tied to other, I suppose you could say, harder military considerations, right?
Exactly. And going back to that Nigerian meth lab that was raided today, 7 Nigerians were arrested, as well as 3 Mexicans who were overseeing the operation and providing the know-how to actually create crystal meth. Right.
Very Breaking Bad, yeah.
Exactly, right? And so we're not just seeing the movement of drugs, we're also seeing the movement of the chemicals and the skills.
Knowledge, yeah. And management. Yeah, interesting. I suppose there's a couple of questions I have, and one would be how much of this human migration is organic and how much of it is now, maybe this is chicken and the egg, but how much of it is now in service of or because of, like would it be that would there still be this level of human migration, because we keep seeing numbers declining in Europe or what have you, were it not for these other business interests that have now become tied up to it. And because obviously they now have an interest in keeping this going, right, and expanding it. To borrow from the other side of these are just poor people trying to escape hardship, which, it's tough to say that when it's all young men, right, that you're seeing. So that's neither here nor there, though. But it's interesting. I'm wondering about that, and like how much of this is now sort of reversed the flow of, not in terms of the direction of people, but in terms of the motivation or what's driving this.
Well, if you go back to Latin America, I mean, there has been a huge drive in migration, right? Because of socioeconomic conditions, mostly in Venezuela, right?
Sir, I saw it when I was in Chile.
Yeah.
Chile, that's how they say it. They told me to put a lot of emphasis on the E, but they were dealing with quite a large influx of Venezuelan and Colombians.
Would you want to explain to the listeners why you're in Chile first?
Oh, I was lecturing down there at the Universidad de los Andes. They were looking at bringing me down as a professor of contemporary history down there. Logistics of it, and it just didn't work out. But that's a wonderful school doing a heck of a lot of work. They're very impressive, and they're building fast. And this is one of the areas they're looking at is security. They were looking at bringing me down as a contemporary history professor because of the sort of security efforts. And there's they have their own military academy there and stuff, but they're starting to look at these regional, global issues, right? And so that's what we were talking about. And so there was some time spent like looking firsthand at the influx of Venezuelan and Colombian migrants to Venezuela, to Chile, pardon me. So that's what I was doing down there.
So, for Latin America, we are seeing a lot of migration because of socioeconomic terms of Venezuela. And then, as the migrants go up to Mexico, you're seeing the Colombians and others essentially joining the route. When it comes to Africa, it is obviously socioeconomic conditions, but it's also conflict driven too, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, you've got issues in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Obviously, you've got Nigeria, Mali, Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone, all
Ethiopia,
have got
Sudan.
Yeah. All have got.
Somalia is always a mess, so there's that.
Libya's toned down a bit, but that could spark back up, although I doubt it, because there's some mediation with the United States and Turkey about reintegrating both sides as a cohesive government. But that's a side note. And of course,
it's also just been going for so long that I think these sorts of things start to. I don't want to overstate this. They have the possibility of exhausting themselves. Possibility, it's not a certainty, because some of these things will just rage and smolder for decades. But that might be part of what's going on in Libya. They do seem to be moving in the direction you've indicated, though.
Yeah. So obviously because of and also global climate change and agricultural issues, it's a powder keg of migration. And, we've seen Europe already, sounding the alarm bells on this, especially, like you said, Italy, the Balkans.
The Balkan nations have been all over the migration thing for quite a long time, because they were one of the key corridors, right?
Even from Syria.
And they have their own problems, right? They have their own problems. They don't, they can't really absorb this the way some of the richer nations in Europe are asking them to.
No, exactly. So going forward, what can be done, right? I mean, Europe is going to do its best to kind of close all the corridors they possibly can, but there's always going to be a human trafficking route, right?
Especially now that, what I was sort of dancing around, because this isn't an area that I know a heck of a lot about, but now that there's a financial incentive to keep it open for these agents that have come in, like the cartels, what have you, and exploited it and turned it into a revenue stream, right? Like they have a vested interest in maintaining this, right?
Exactly. And again, these are high level operations from
and they're
Latin
savvy.
America.
They're very savvy too, right? A lot of them have political and military training, so destabilization efforts. You're almost like non-state actors, but almost like a state in a lot of ways, right? And they're highly sophisticated. So destabilization efforts are not beyond their capacity to consider or execute.
No, and of course, my concern going forward is cartel training for jihadists. It's oddly enough, a couple weeks ago we saw how Boko Haram and Islamic State West African Province in Nigeria is actually using Chat GDP, Claude, and
I caught
other,
that. Yeah.
other AI language models on how to modify a bike to go over an entrenchment. Bomb making techniques was also one of those searches that they've been done, and it was
Tactical
actually
planning. Yeah.
and it was interesting that there was an article actually said that it was actually done by a PowerPoint presentation to these groups, and then that PowerPoint presentation was given throughout the network, and that was just
Interesting.
within Al Qaeda network itself. But if the Mexican cartels and other Latin American ones get involved, well, will there be a creation of semi-submersible submarines going from Africa to Europe? Right, it's being done now across the Atlantic.
I think
Like
that's only a matter of time.
exactly, and I know some of the listeners until maybe just now are like, okay, these guys are just talking about migration and maybe against it a bit more, but no, there are security concerns going forward, right? All of a sudden, it's not just the trafficking of humans or drugs, it's explosives, it's weapons, it's a terrorist cell that could potentially carry out an attack in Spain, Madrid, Italy, the Balkans, wherever else within Europe.
For a stated aim too, right? Like it may not simply be jihadism. It could be part of this larger sort of thing that we've both been sort of circling, right? About revenue streams and finances and making money, right? And sort of informal war with between these illegal actors and states for these avenues, these roads, inroads to make their money, right? A lot of motivation for doing it. Part of the problem with this topic is that it's extremely like sensitive, right? It's a very loaded subject because there's a lot of people on both the left and right, the I would say the extreme left and extreme right, who they're not honest actors and they're using certain issues as a cloak to hide ulterior motives. So there's a lot of knee-jerk reaction when you start talking about migration, especially when you look at the West and the prevalence of like progressive governments, and you hear someone start talking about security issues and say, well, I'd like to remind you that we're both Canadian and this is a country of largely built on immigration, continues to be, right? The West has a lot of aging population and needs skilled workers and also like unskilled labor as well. So this isn't about getting rid of all of the immigrants or stop. It's about illegal migration, uncontrolled, right? Where you don't have vetting and stuff, which is what the issue is, I suppose, amongst European powers with Spain, particularly with this amnesty, right? Where they're like, you got to be really careful about who you're bringing in. And to circle it back to Canada just for a second, even if you're on this, there's still problems. Like if you look at the U.S. and how many people they arrested off the terrorist watch list last year trying to enter the U.S., it was trying to get this off the top of my head. Probably gonna get it wrong, but it was like 600 or something, and like 87% of them were from Canada, which they had to fly to. Like we're a pretty developed nation and CBSA fell down on the ground on the job and let these people in, right? So I don't know if I have those numbers right, and I want to stress that the point is the vast majority of those being arrested from a terrorist watch list entering the U.S. were from Canada. This is a country that shares intelligence with the U.S. We probably have the most integrated military and intelligence system anywhere, right? Even above Five Eyes is Canada and the U.S. Even with Trump's bluster, like we're highly integrated and we know what we're doing. So if we can't do that, what does that say for lesser switched on states, right? So there's a genuine threat here that something can slip through, and you have to understand that there are actually bad actors who are intentionally trying to exploit that, right? It's not just accidental.
What about the reverse? I mean, we've already talked about how drugs are coming, west to east. What about terrorist activity east to west through Latin America? I mean, I know that's been a point of contention and concern for some time as
Mm-hmm.
well. It is a possibility going forward, depending on how lucrative deals can be done. The bigger concern is for Europe, right? There is a huge the Mediterranean Sea is not monitored well enough for human trafficking, for drugs, and going forward, situation is only going to get worse.
The Mediterranean is huge. but it's not insurpassable, right? Like it is possible to transverse that for, motivated non-state actors, especially like on the level of cartels, right? Like they've got the money to do these things if they're so inclined. So I think the days of arguing this isn't a problem are well behind us, which is something I think one side of the political debate really needs to get over and wake up to. I also think that there's probably give and take on both sides. But I think the age of thinking this is a temporary problem or it'll go away or it's not as bad as it seems is going away. And I think that's more the symbolic thing that this event in Ceuta represents. It's not so much Ceuta, it's what Ceuta has come to represent. It's more the straw breaking the camel's back. Although I don't know that this will be that straw, but I think that's what, to contextualize all the hoopla around it. I think that's what's going, at least my view. I don't know. You probably agree with that too, right?
Oh, I definitely agree, especially how it's also been framed, right? Maloney's right-wing government versus Pedro Sanchez's Spanish Socialist Workers Party, right? Moving forward, how does that political conversation change? Because again, as you and I have talked about this, until we actually clearly outlined that it is a security concern that Latin American drug cartels are dealing with jihadist groups and other criminal organizations. That is a security threat. But how do you move the political conversation from, like you were saying, extreme left to extreme right?
Well, how do you move it from culture war to rational? To your point, these are like legitimate objective security, like objectively speaking, security concerns. And that's where the conversation needs to be, is in rational and pragmatic, but it's instead tied up in this culture war. And to be fair, like I consider myself a moderate, somebody in the middle and nonpartisan, but a lot of blame for this has to go to the progressives over the last decade, who were just unwilling to acknowledge anything from the right, and in a way sort of shut them out and radicalized them, because they were just like, oh no, you're just a racist, and like just engaged in like ad hominem attacks instead of engaging with the actual ideas. And that's created a similar problem now on the right, where they're just as reactionary and intolerant. And so the conversation on both sides has been degraded, or the capacity for rational conversation has been degraded.
Well, and I think the conversation, rational conversation can't actually exist within illegal migration and drug smuggling and human trafficking until there is another big event like Ceuta, but one with bigger security.
God forbid something worse.
Exactly, but one with bigger security implications. Migration or an attack in the Mediterranean.
We're going to see these things start. It's clearly going to be in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, and you're right. We are going to see it start. The question is when. Well, sooner than anyone wants to think, and a lot sooner than any rational conversation can happen.
Yeah, because the one has to happen before the other, right? Because before the rational conversation can happen, there has to be enough to shock everyone and being like, oh, okay, like we need to deal with this, which is similar to, and that doesn't happen at an instant turning point, right? It seems that way in hindsight. History has a trick of doing that to us, right? But these things are gradual, right? Even conversations concerning Russia, right? Like even after the invasion of Ukraine, there's still people who don't get it and don't seem to understand what they're, and like I'm not talking about regular people on the street, although that's included, but even like European leaders who are speaking in terms that are completely detached from the reality of what they're facing.
Well, exactly. I mean, look at even with jihadism in Africa, right? I mean, Afghanistan is done and over with. Everyone wants to forget about it, but the Al Qaeda networks are still operating in Africa and flourishing. ISIS is still flourishing to some degree in Africa. And now there is a boost in its financials from Latin America drug organizations. So the threat is getting worse, but no one wants to talk about it.
Yeah, and the reactions are getting more aggressive too. Like, and it's creating fault lines in the EU. Like, look at what's going on with Greece, right? Like, the Greek authorities, one of their Coast Guard has confirmed one of their Coast Guard vessels had opened fire on a migrant boat and killed a passenger. This was a couple of years ago. So this was actually this is an ongoing thing. Point is, the Greek government is hardening in their response, at least at the front line, at the level of the ships going out there to meet them, right? And that creates tension in the EU, and that's going to continue to happen. You're going to have leaders like Maloney that are going to say, you know what, to hell with the financial penalties, we're dealing with this, because the financial costs of not dealing with it are worse for Italy than anything the EU can do to us. And you're going to start to see unilateral action. which is going to create more tension in the EU. So it's something that needs to be dealt with, because it's not just because it's a security risk, but because it's a destabilization risk.
Fair enough. There's actually one stat that I forgot to mention. In Nigeria, so on the global average of drug users, it's 5.5% of the population. In Nigeria, it's almost triple that, 14.4% estimated. So you can already see the destabilization effect that
Yeah.
there. It is like a disease. It will spread, and those numbers will go up in Europe.
Yeah, so I suppose, I don't know if that's where we want to leave it. This is not an area that I'm in any way an expert in, or even close to. So we've danced around a lot of things where we haven't necessarily dug in as well as we could have. But I think the underlying point here is that there are legitimate security and criminal concerns like associated with this migration issue that this Ceuta situation sort of has represents for certain people, and it should, because it is sort of symbolic of a larger problem that needs to be dealt with. And the photos and the videos are pretty compelling. So it's a shocking, it's a shock to the system, and it needs to be, right, because the Mediterranean is going to get worse, and there is a need to be real about this. And migration is a tough one because it's emotionally evoking. You see, people trying to, in some cases, legitimately escape war zones, and they're hard done by, and they want help. And you're only human, so you want to sympathize, but you can't help anyone if you allow this, because it's going to destroy your ability to do anything. Right? You have to maintain your own ability to function if you're going to have any impact anywhere else. Right? Like, there's no point in letting yourself collapse.
And you are right. I'm more rooted in Africa, so I've got a little more specialty with the drug network there with the jihadist groups. But you are right. We both aren't experts on the whole migration thing in Europe, but we've hit a lot of points that no one is talking about in Europe, right?
That need to be connected to what the conversation that's currently beginning to play out in Ceuta and
exactly
among European powers. Yeah,
and that's why when we were talking this weekend, what topic we're going to discuss today, it wasn't a conversation. It was, well, we can talk about Ceuta, or we can talk about, no, let's just talk about Ceuta.
It's an exploration. Like, we're sort of, I guess, spitballing or something in real time here, when letting everyone listen to us, sort of, that there's this emotive this emotional screening of like migration, which makes the conversation even more difficult. But it needs to occur because you're seeing the damage that's occurring due to the fact that it hasn't been addressed, right? And this is something you're seeing in the UK with their government, you're seeing with Italy, you're seeing with Greece, you're seeing in the Balkans, you're seeing in Scandinavian countries. Like, the governments that are more mainstream or center or progressive are increasingly under siege from increasingly reactionary right-wing parties because of their inability to confront the fact that they were wrong about this, and they need to have a more nuanced conversation. Wrong might not be the right word. They need to have a more nuanced conversation about this.
And in Africa, we're seeing the effects of human trafficking, jihadism, criminal gangs, and the influx of drugs in that continent.
You're seeing a reminder too that we live in a global world, and like, it's not enough. Like, these isolationists on the right too, that you're seeing, like, oh well, we're just going to shut ourselves off. No, if your neighbor collapses, this is a problem for you.
Exactly.
Right.
And I think on that note, we're going to end the Defense Port podcast for this week. Well, our listeners, thank you very much for listening to our mutual diatribe, and until next time.